Here we are again, the YouTube channel. I'm here with my dear friend and wonderful artist, Eric Boulanger. Eric is a Grammy Award-winning mastering engineer. He has taken over the space that I spent 40 years with Doug Sachs in the mastering lab. When Doug left the planet, I figured the best way to get close to Doug Sachs was to get somebody who'd worked with him for 10 years, and so I immediately swooped in on Eric, and we've done everything that I've ever recorded since that point on at his wonderful room, the bakery, which is at the Thalberg building in Culver City. It's at the end of the rainbow. If you've ever been to Sony, you'll know exactly what it is. So Eric's here because I asked him to come. We want to do an interview with him because I think you guys all need to hear what it's like to have somebody of his expertise expound on his career and his ability to make all the recordings that I record sound wonderful, and millions of other artists as well. I mean, from Colbie Caillat to you name it. So, welcome, Eric.
Thank you very much, and it's a grave honor hearing those words out of your mouth because I think the interview should go the other way.
Well, fortunately for me, and you were kind enough to come and do this because I really respect what you do and how you do it, and I think that other people should be able to, understand, because there's a lot of people today that want to just buy a mastering plug-in, and that's what they think is the way to master a record, which, it just doesn't work that way. Still, no matter how good the mastering plug-ins are. That's somebody else's idea of what it should sound like, and not really.
Well, either way, they're still just tools. And you haven't even asked me a question yet, but it was one of the things, our dear friend, but how I got started, my first mentor was Al Schmidt.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that always stuck with me with him that he would say to me was, get it right the first time. And the whole concept behind that, even up until the mastering standpoint, is we're still making art, we're still making a record, and we're making music. Even if you're an engineer, this is your instrument, And a plugin, if you have a plugin or a console and you leave it there, what is it going to make a record? No. It takes the artist behind it, and that's everything to do with what you and I do on a daily basis. And getting it right the first time is like, there's far too often, especially in recording situations where people will do something. It's like, the famous phrase, we'll fix it in post. No, like if it's not coming out the speakers on the first note the way that you're intending or envisioning, then change it. Like, get there.
Yeah, it's not the way it works. Anyway, so the questions that I want to start with: where were you born and raised, and what did your parents do?
Oh, wow. Okay. I was born and raised in Highland Park, New Jersey, and to a Frenchman and an American Irish immigrant family on my mom's side. And my parents both, my dad was originally a banker, specifically a computer programmer in banks. And then after that was sick of it and ended up becoming the captain of our paramedic squad.
Really?
Yeah, talk about a shift, but
no,
that's him. Well, both of them are retired now. And then my mom, her entire life, her studies, and then what she did, she was a teacher, and specifically when she was teaching, primarily was in adult education. So especially New Jersey being and New York being one of those gateways to America with a lot of immigrants, she'd be teaching a lot of immigrants, recent immigrants to the country, many of whom were illiterate. And this isn't a insult. This is the definition of the word illiteracy, meaning like there's many cultures that, for instance, women aren't taught to read or write.
Yeah.
Never mind be able to speak English once they get here.
Right.
So she really had her hands full. But some of the best people, like the countless gifts that would come over from all these families and her students for, now they're working members of American culture, and she taught them how to read, write, and speak English at the same time. How she did, don't know. But
Well, one of the questions I would ask you of that is, did she help you with your homework?
absolutely. In fact, one of my greatest success stories was, okay, fine, I'll come out on camera. I'm technically a grad school dropout. I had the great idea that when I came out to LA, I would go to USC for my master's. And I dropped out because I couldn't stand it anymore. But I was only doing it to defer my loans. But for a terrible idea. I do not recommend this of anyone. But my GRE, I had a perfect in math. That was expected. Verbal, I had like 40th percentile because I literally was tired of it and I left the testing center. But the writing is the hardest thing, and it's subjectively scaled on graded on a scale of 1 to 5, and like 4 is like the 90th percentile. Like most everyone who does great on it gets a 4. I was one of something like 15 people in the country who got a 5, and
Wow.
I will thank my mom for that. She taught me how to
tuned
write.
you up, right?
Yep.
Oh, that's
And so when
wonderful.
in the interviews for grad school, like the committee was like, "How the hell do you get a 5? Like one of few in the country on writing, but like completely flunk the verbal." I'm like, because it was boring and I wanted to get out of there. They're like, "You're a piece of work."
Okay, well, I'm glad you had that kind of background. What formal musical training did you have?
Well, it all started. Actually, great question. First question about my parents. Well, I gave you their background, but they were not musicians. There were no musicians in the family. And still to this day, I haven't really gotten a straight answer because I don't think they even remember. Maybe they saw an ad in the newspaper. Who knows? But at the age of 3, my parents thought it was a good idea to start me with violin lessons, and I never stopped.
Wow, you started when you were 3.
Yeah, that's not a joke.
No
and
wonder
from
you're
2
good.
non-musician parents,
Wow.
who knows where this came from? They still have not given me a straight answer. So, Mom and Dad, if you're watching this, at least come up with a story.
Tell them about it, and then they can watch it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because my father was a singer all of his life.
Yeah, I know.
And an actor, and so I was around it all my life, but was never really thought that was the path that I was going to take. I was going to Stanford to become a doctor, and
Yeah.
it just so happened that I got in a band in the 60s.
Well, you actually got your degree too, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But but in the 60s,
You just never practiced.
you didn't have a lot of luck with chicks in a lab class, but you could do it really well in a band. That was my motivation back then. Well,
Won't lie, that kind of had something to do with my path.
But your formal education, you had
Formal education, yeah. So started when I was 3, and with this whole saga with my parents, I did the Suzuki method, which is very popular for young string players. And then
Was that invented in Japan?
yeah, by Shinichi Suzuki in, don't quote me, I think sometime in the 60s or something like that.
But what does that mean, the Suzuki method?
It's just a methodology. It's like book 1, 2, 3, like a kind of a graduated process of going through little basic
And they teach
songs.
music theory and
you're with
everything?
a teacher, but the main concept behind the Suzuki method actually ties into my parents. Is it's mainly, especially for your formative like first years when you're 3 years old, the teacher is more teaching the parents about how to do everything because you're doing everything by ear. Of course, you're not reading music yet. How most kids at that age aren't reading yet.
Yeah, right.
So it doesn't have to do with reading music. It's more ear training and getting habit.
Uh-huh.
And also that has to be with the parents to guide that because, of course, you're not going to be with your teacher every single day,
Right.
especially then. So the Suzuki method really stems from like training the parents to be able to have this environment for the kid to and it takes a long time
Well, yeah, I mean, if
before
you
you stop sounding like you're killing a cat.
if you start at 3, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah.
The other thing that I forgot to mention is, aside from being one of the best mastering engineers in the country, he is also a formidable violinist in Los Angeles, in a lot of symphony and string sessions for film and television, and actually records as well. So
Yeah.
that's his side gig, you know. That's what he moonlights as a violinist. That's what happened from
It's
that
just
part.
funny. Well, now everyone knows that came first.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have been here if that didn't come
Right.
first. Like
But
that,
I'm just
that
saying,
was the inspiration.
now your vocation is a mastering
Yeah.
engineer, but your you know,
Right.
moonlight gig is you're an excellent violinist. So there's nothing
it's
wrong
fun.
with that. The next question I want to know is how you got into the business. And I want to hear whatever Doug Sachs stories you might have.
Oh, fantastic! Of which I have plenty.
Yeah,
And
I'm sure. Doug Sachs, we all know, is the mastering engineer that I worked with for 40 years at the Mastering Lab, who kind of pioneered mastering in this country.
it invented mastering as we know it. That's
Yeah.
for sure. And I'll get to that point. But I guess I'll answer a question. I didn't actually answer your last question, but we'll skip ahead to when it came to undergrad time. I went to Carnegie Mellon, and because my grades weren't all that great or anything, and this is an amazing school, guess what? I got in as a violin major, but within a semester, I knew I didn't want to study violin or music anymore. I was done with it because I had done Manhattan School of Music and Juilliard before that, and it was just all the same. So I got into CMU the back door with my violin, and then I transferred into the engineering department. So I actually left, and my degree is in Bachelor of Science of Electrical and Computer Engineering.
Oh, really?
And this goes right into how I got into this business. And they happen to have at CMU a recording studio. But again, I was doing all of this because I was interested in the recording field. Like, I always loved how any record would sound and how that was done. I'd always be playing around on my own, including like when I was young, like recording my youth orchestra with a mini disc recorder. I mean, it was at the time. God only knows that was a terrible idea, but you know, it was fun.
It was the formative years.
Exactly. Nothing to
I don't want
brag.
to tell you about any of the,
it was not Grammy nominated. But
I don't want to tell you about any of the cassette recordings
Yeah.
and the, you know, reel-to-reel nightmare that I recorded and sent to Capitol Records in 1965 and went to the mailbox every day for 6 months waiting for the response. When I got the form letter back, thanks, but no thanks. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, you got to cut your teeth somehow.
Yeah, we've all been down that part.
Oh, absolutely. So, but specifically when I got to CMU, they had a recording studio there, and it was nothing. It's not like they had a program for like recording engineering or anything like that. There were just a handful of classes that you could take. Because of that, it was kind of like open door. And the second I walked in, I was just like, whatever I do, I want to be here, you know, in this environment. And so because it wasn't like a major thing, like I do my independent study there, and I had keys to the place. So if I wasn't in class or at home, you could guarantee I was in there, and I was doing anything and everything I could. And that's what led me on my first opportunity, which was bugging the hell out of Paula Salvatore, to her chagrin. But I called her 4 days in a row, 3 times a day, and on the 12th call, finally she took it. And I was like, I want to intern for you and work. And she's like, yeah. And so she let me come in for an interview. I dressed up.
Paula is the one that launched your career?
It was Paula. I am here
God.
because of Paula. No questions asked, period. She gave me my first shot and everything. And of course, being at the time, introduced me to Al, and then Al took me under his wing. And while I was there for
Al,
this,
he talks about
Al
Al
Schmidt.
like
Yeah.
Al Schmidt, one of the most legendary engineers of all time.
Yeah, I mean, talk
29.
about how lucky I was.
Yeah.
And I can't believe I even forced my way in there and convinced Paula, but it was the opportunity of a lifetime. And Al really taught me so many things. And originally I wanted to be a mixer and whatnot, but when I finished college and permanently moved to LA, it was time to actually get a job and not be an intern. And long story short, Al was the one to put me in touch with Doug. And basically, when Al Schmidt tells you to go interview for Doug Sachs, if you're not in a car right away, you should just quit.
Yeah.
Even though mastering wasn't really in my purview at the time,
Right.
you go. And then Doug hired me on the spot. I'm like, well, I guess I'm mastering now. And it was the best thing that ever happened because, I mean, Al gave me my start and fundamentals and whatnot, what I got to witness and be surrounded by, especially something so familiar as, especially that summer, we were doing a lot of string sections. So obviously something I'm familiar with, but with Doug, Doug taught me everything.
Yeah.
And
pretty amazing guy.
Spent a long time with him. So
how many years were you there? You were there
9.
9. I thought you were there 10, but yeah,
close.
That was my guess. Yeah, 9 years. The next question that I have. Well, you didn't give me any good Doug Sachs stories.
We need Doug Sachs stories.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Doug is a character, you know.
Well, the perfect one actually goes right with exactly what we're talking about. I will tell you about the day I met Doug and when I went up on that interview. First of all, it was before the days of GPS, like on your phone. So
you had a hard time finding it.
Well, no, you had the MapQuest printout as you're going, and I'm still new to Southern California, and this interview was in the Ojai location, and Ojai is about an hour and a half north of LA. And Doug always said it best, like for people who are unfamiliar with SoCal, Doug would always say, Ojai is the closest place to LA without feeling anything like it. And I think that's very true.
Yeah. Well, Ojai is like almost like going to the wine country in Napa.
Right, yeah.
It's that remote, but it's still within an hour and a half of a populated city. The thing I want to interject too is Doug Sachs originally started at the Mastering Lab in Hollywood on Gower in a storefront. And that's where I met him, and that's where I first started mastering records with him back in the 70s. And after being in that business for, I don't know, what year did he move to Ojai?
He bought the building in 2003. The studio was probably actually starting to be used more like 2005-ish,
So from 1963...
7. Was in 1967 he opens the original
But he
lab.
was banging around in 63.
Well, he was also a musician back then, too.
But it's 67.
And his brother was doing everything with Armin.
Because Michael Lloyd owned the room behind...
Producer's Workshop.
Yeah, and sold it to Ed Cobb. So Michael Lloyd started that studio that was attached to the Mastering Lab.
Oh, and back then it was called Curb Records and
Michael
Sidewalk Recording.
Sidewalk Recording,
that was the
because he
joke.
was partners with Mike Curb, who had Sidewalk Productions.
Right.
But the point I wanted to make is that was all those years that he worked in that store in Hollywood on Hollywood Boulevard, just east of Gower, and all those years it took him. Finally, he got out of Los Angeles and moved to the Ojai location, which I was like, oh my God, do I really have to go to Ojai to do this? But I did it, and that's where I met you, interestingly enough.
And,
so finish your story.
So yeah, first day of going up there, I'm there with MapQuest going up, and of course Doug over the phone gives me the instructions to go up, let's call it the back way, so up the 5 and the 126 through Fillmore.
Oh my God.
And then through the mountains. It a little convoluted, but and for a New Jersey kid, and mind you, when I grew up, I never even drove a car.
I mean, why did he give you that? You go up to 101 and you take the road to Ojai.
It's Doug is the point. So I'm going up this cockamamie way, and like I swear to you, at some point somewhere around Fillmore, there was like the classic tumbleweed going across the freeway. I'm like, where's the road runner? Like, this is far into a New Jersey. Yeah, right? Exactly. And I remember even stopping at gas stations asking if I was in the right direction. They're like, yeah, keep going. You're all good. And it's like, it felt like an eternity for whatever reason. I finally get there. walk in, see the receptionist, and then she's like, "Oh yeah, oh, you can go in the main room," he said. So I meet Doug for the first time in the studio in Ojai, and his first words to me is, "Who are you?" And I was like, just yesterday you asked me to come up here to interview for you," and he's like, "Oh yeah, what's your name again?" "Eric." And he's like, "All right, sit down." And we started at the time. Uh, he was thinking about bringing back the old school mastering lab preamps for microphone preamps. And in that topology, there's one capacitor that's really pretty crucial in the signal chain of this topology. And the way he and his brother would always test it is you'd load it into the tape machine, because with the NAB curve or whichever curve you're using, it's pretty much like a one-pole filter. And so that means all of your audio is going through that. So he's using, I don't know if I should be saying this, but rest in peace, you're off the hook. He was using a Diana Crawlmaster for his test bench on the tape machine, and flipping between different capacitors so that we could sonically hear what was going on. And the genius behind that, of course, is it's making the playback curve for the tape machine itself, but that means all the audio, it's like as stressed as it possibly could. That would never be the case in the preamp, but if a cap could take that, it could take anything, is the point. And
He
so
used
we
to
were
do that a
doing
lot, though.
Yeah, and then he literally put me in the front chair, and I didn't know at the time what he was flicking, because everything's like hand built, but he just started like doing an audition. He's like, "Tell me this or that." Click, click, click. That. Okay. This or that. This. Does it about 5 times, and he turns around and he does his like old man, like he had like a Santa Claus chuckle. He'd be like, huh, "Kid's got ears." He's like, "Okay, let's go to lunch." And I'm still there sitting like, what the hell just happened, And it's like, okay, I guess
Classic
we're going to
Doug.
lunch. And he would, him, he would always value his lunchtime.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the time, he had a 1937 Cadillac. We pile into this old thing that I'm surprised you didn't have to crank up yourself to drive like 4 blocks down, and we have a lovely fish lunch. It was like decadent by my standards. I'm like, okay, this is amazing. And it was the middle of summer and it was hot as all hell. And so we're done with lunch. We piled back in, all of us, into this old 37 Cadillac. And on this very short drive, I guess he pulled in front of a cop, and this car didn't have a license plate. Like, it had fallen off, and Doug just doesn't care. So we get pulled over. And, clearly a 37 Caddy doesn't have air conditioning. And so we're, pulled over on the side of the road with the cop coming up, who was obviously not in a good mood either. And I mean, like the beads of sweat, like there's 4 of us in the back bench seat.
Dying.
Dying. And I remember Josh Florian was with us, and it was Josh in his demeanor of, Josh is kind of straight to the point guy.
Yeah.
Like leans over to the cop. He's like, "Officer, it's hot as hell here. We work right there. Can we leave?" And he kind of looks at the 4 of us back there, and he's like, "Yeah, you're free to leave." And we're like, "We out." So the 4 of us now, and I just met everyone, walk back to the mastering lab, and I'm kind of waiting in the lobby for Doug. And this takes like 20 minutes. And then finally Doug, I guess, gets back, and the front door flies open, nearly breaking it. And Doug is like so pissed because he got a ticket, of course. And he looks at me again, despite this whole morning now. He looks at me, he's like, "Who are you?" I'm like, "Oh my God. What am I doing here?" And I'm like, supposedly interviewing. Oh, right. He's like, "Come upstairs." I'm like, "Okay." And upstairs he had a pool table, and he whips out the whiskey, pours 2 drinks, and racks up the balls, and he's like, "We're playing pool." And that's when we really started getting to know each other, and it was his way of de-stressing from the cop incident. And I'm not saying that I'm a good pool player by any means, but in this circumstance, I kind of swept the board and I was on the 8 ball while he had like 10 still left on the table. And Doug said to me, you know, it's illegal to beat the boss in pool on his own table. And that's when the jersey came out of me. I was like, well, therein lies our problem. You ain't my boss yet. And he's like, you start on Monday. And I took the cue ball and I threw it into a pocket on purpose. And he's like,
smart man. It's funny because I met Doug Sachs when I went to work at the Sound Factory. Dave Hassinger, who is one of the most famous engineers in that era, he and Al Schmidt actually worked together at RCA Studios for years. And Dave was the main engineer at the time. He did all the Rolling Stones records in the 60s, starting with The Last Time, Satisfaction, Under My Thumb, 19th Nervous Breakdown, all those famous or infamous Rolling Stones hits. He also did the first 3 Jefferson Airplane records. He did the first 3 Grateful Dead records. He was an amazing dude, and he taught me. And Al Schmidt worked at RCA at the same time. Dave moonlighted as a producer for Warner Brothers and found a band called, what was the name of the band? They had a huge hit called I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night. And the money that he made from that hit, he bought the Sound Factory.
I remember the stories from Al too, especially in those times with those studios. There was kind of rank and file, like you were a staff engineer, and then you could work your way up to like staff producer. And
well, they let him go.
He wasn't very. Al never really wanted to do producing.
Yeah,
but he's like the paycheck was better.
So the next thing we want to talk about is how you and I met.
Well.
So you can give us a little background on that from your perspective.
Well, forgive me, I don't remember which session it was, because...
Which artist it was?
Yeah. Do you even have an idea? Because there's too many sessions to think of. Clearly, it was definitely in Ojai with Doug when I was assisting him.
Yeah, I think... there's so many projects I was doing at that point in time.
I'd be shocked if you could remember if I can't.
It might have been Bonnie Peace.
Doesn't sound familiar now.
Yeah, it might have been that. It might have been, shoot.
I'm guessing it was around 07.
Yeah.
Whatever that would have been. But
I'd have to look up in my discography on on All Music that it gives you the dates.
Well, you also wanted Doug's stories, so I do remember the first time meeting the great Val Garay coming in, and of course we knew the session was coming in, so I was being the polite assistant, but I was very excited to meet you when you were coming in and see what comes in. But before that, Doug was preparing me, and Doug took great pride in liking to explain to everyone how you were the only person in history to have been kicked out of the mastering lab 3 times. And that the pivotal times were your differences in opinion about how to set up the Dolby with the tape. And I remember the first session was definitely a Dolby tape print.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, Eric, you're going to have to set it up like this. Don't ask. And he'd start like bitching about everything. And I'm like, well, Doug, that's not really that big of a deal. I'm like, whatever. And lo and behold, every time you would bring that in, it would sound phenomenal. So it's like, I don't know. I'm like, these guys just have too much history. You guys bantered like 2 little brothers, I was like, whatever. I'm just going to learn from both of them.
Well, it was an interesting time, when you think about all those records that I mastered with him. I'd be mastering at the mastering lab on Hollywood Boulevard at 5 in the afternoon on a Friday. And Saturday, I'd be driving down the freeway and the record would be on the radio.
Yeah.
That's how fast it happened. I mean, I'd put out a Linda Ronstadt album. I mean, it just was like instant.
Well, this was only a story I was told, of course, because it would have happened before I was even born. But you might remember Doug said that there was a famous, the old location, of course, mastering lab, where he had set up an FM transmitter in the parking lot so that people could do like the car test, because of course this is before those days. And apparently he had done it so much and whatnot that the FCC actually found him.
Oh, really?
It was like a illegal
Oh my God.
broadcast, and like he didn't get fined, but he got the warning letter, and it's like, okay, I guess we can't do this anymore.
What were some of Doug's accomplishments? You can expound on that.
Oh, I mean, the biggest of which is the artistry in the form of what we call mastering now. He literally invented, because before the mastering lab in 1967 and Doug, of course, this was always happening at the record labels, kind of in that studio form world where the business structure was very vertically integrated. But at those times, the people who would be doing the equivalent to what we do, especially, of course, it's all vinyl, so they're cutting the vinyl, but they were referred to as transfer engineers. And it was just the mixer would cut the tape and have the notes, and the transfer engineer just got that thing onto a lacquer. And then it was Doug, because he was a musician, he was a trumpet major at UCLA. Then, because of like Korean War days and whatnot, he served in the 7th Army Symphony, because everyone was drafted back then. And it tells you how good of a player he was, because if you could play an instrument, instead of being on the front lines, you wanted to be in the Army Symphony. And he auditioned and got in. So that meant he wasn't on, you still have to do basic, but you're not on the front lines. You're playing for the troops.
Yeah.
Or, in those days, it was a lot of, it was after World War II. It's a lot of outreach to like different countries and everything. And
well, he was probably
cultural outreach.
Around the time of the Korean War.
Yeah, that's when he was. But I think it was like 52 that he was in there. But nonetheless, he was a monster player. He gets back after he was done with the Army and done with college. And that's when he really started getting into recording more than anything. And what ended up becoming Sheffield Records, the direct disc label, a few years later, it all stemmed from this. It was he and his brother, his brother, Burt Sachs, was the main designer of all the equipment originally in the mastering lab.
I thought Sherwood was.
Oh, Burt's his nickname.
Oh,
okay.
Sherwood.
His real name is Sherwood Sachs, but he'd go by Burt.
Yeah, Sherwood. That's how I was introduced.
No, that's his real name.
Yeah, he built everything.
Yeah, and at the time he was working with Armin Steiner on his studio. He built that whole tube console and all of that. And Doug gets back, and they start doing a few recordings. And they did something just for fun at some studio. I can't remember what it was, but it was close by in Hollywood. And they cut just a piano directly to 78. And it was like, he was like, the sound was, it didn't sound like anything that you could buy, even remotely. And he's like, what's wrong here? And he and Burt just realized, well, we can cut this better. And so they opened the first independent mastering, which was like a mind blow and upset to the vertically integrated system of like the label, their studios, their engineers, and then out goes a record. It's like, well, at this point, we can do it better. And so one by one, producers would start sending them it, because it's like, our records sound better like this.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's certainly his greatest accolade.
Yeah.
Inventing a field.
Yeah. Which he did.
Yeah.
And not only that one, but others too. I mean, in the audio professional audio world, I mean, at the Sound Factory where I worked, and at Record One when I built it, And to this day, these speakers, they all have Mastering Lab crossovers in them. So he designed crossovers that everybody replaced the original crossovers in all these speaker systems. It didn't matter what kind of speakers they were. I mean, he just knew how to make things sound better.
It was musicianship. That's it.
Yeah. And I was a musician to start with, too. I was a guitar player, songwriter.
I was about to say, there's a link here.
Yeah, so there's something to be said for that. Did you ever meet Arnie Acosta?
Of course, and absolutely loved Arnie. And in fact, he maybe it was kind of early on in my career with Doug at the Mastering Lab, but Arnie, I hope I'm not saying it wrong. I think he had moved to Hawaii. And he was kind of off the radar for a good amount of time. He considered himself like retired, but he would come back and he'd have a handful of gigs. And for whatever reason, no one else wanted to assist him, I guess from prior, there's a lot of egos in this business and whatnot, but like, I sure as hell was not going to miss an opportunity to assist him. And so he and I'd always assist him because he wouldn't know his way around the studio whatsoever. But I just, got all the stories and
he was the
could
night
sit
guy.
in on how, and well, funny enough, we'd always work at night. So maybe I didn't know. I figured that was a schedule thing, but maybe that was his preference.
When Doug was the day guy, Arnie did all the lacquer cutting at night and everything that had to be done before it went off to the plants.
So we got along so well.
Arnie was a character.
And he gave me a lot of confidence to like move forward and, just use your ears. And I'll never forget those few sessions that we got to work on.
There was
together.
another really great mastering engineer that came out of the Mastering Lab and at that period of time too, and that was Gavin Lurson. Did you ever see him?
Gavin and I are close friends.
Okay, see, so there you have it, man. The alumni that came out of the Mastering Lab, including you, which,
I got to say, I guess I'm a little biased, but Doug was pretty good at picking his hires.
Doug was pretty good at picking everything.
Yeah.
I got to say that. What do you think made Doug Sachs hire you?
I have no idea.
Really?
Well, I mean, aside from the sole exception that he was down a staff member, and
I mean, I'm sure you had a lot of people.
Especially the story that I just retold to you. Like, he didn't even remember why I was there 3 times during the day.
He does that on purpose. That's his little...
It was always a question mark with him, but there's sometimes he would do things like that on purpose. There's other times where it's just, he just doesn't care. But,
So you don't know why he hired you?
I mean... I like to think it was competency and intelligence.
Yeah.
And passion.
I mean, he's a very particular guy. I mean, about everything.
But there was no standout moment aside from not cleaning up the pool table that that would have dictated in that interview why he hired me. I mean, and especially with him in a job like that. Yeah, it's one thing that maybe you get the interview and now you're hired, but your real audition is the next 3 months, Like, because at any point in time, if you ain't working out,
you're gone. What is your philosophy when mastering a record?
Philosophy?
Yeah, what is your philosophy, your overall philosophy of what you attempt to do when you're mastering a record for somebody, a major artist like Colbie Caillat, which you did all of those records?
Major philosophy is immediately, whatever it may be, I have an immediate semblance of where in my head it would want to exist. And I don't know if you could necessarily call that experience, but it's kind of more life experience. It's just the countless records you even listen to as a fan or a kid growing up on the radio, and like having that concept of it's here and it should be here. For instance, if I'm so lucky as maybe it's something with orchestras, that to me, I just get a little bit of a freebie because not too many people are orchestral musicians. Like, I know what it sounds like to be on stage with a full orchestra. And, a lot of, especially like string sweetening for pop tracks or something like that, obviously that'll exist. And the second you can't hear that last stand, second violin, like my ear knows that right away, and it's almost magical how you dial in an EQ where it's like, now I can hear the last stand, and then everything else works. So that's kind of, but that's a meism, just because I'm used. It's kind of like going home, and it's like, oh no, the address is here. But with everything else, it's just an innate immediacy of knowing where you want to go, and having the confidence to stick to it, or also the confidence to be able to be open-minded to sometimes things surprise you.
Well,
because you're still making music at that point, is the point.
Right. You've mastered records for me, and we never really have any kind of friction when we're doing it. I mean, we have a pretty decent dialogue, but usually when I get, when you're ready for me to listen to a song and, in the album, and you got it where you think it's right, and then I just sit there and go back and forth between completely flat and what you've done. And if I don't like something, I just tell you what I do or don't like, and then you go right away and make another change.
Yeah, which is just, that's like what I call musicianship. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's just we're taking a journey.
Yeah.
And for our viewers, I'll say that when I make those changes, what he's talking about with Valgaray, it's usually something on the order of tenths of a dB. So we're not talking about some day and night change here.
No.
But that also, one thing Doug would always say is, like, you're not going to learn how to master with a Valgaray mix. And it's true. I mean, when you get to the higher echelons of your craft, like whatever walks in my door at the bakery, whoever's affording my rate and doing all of this, there's a 99% chance that those people have hired all of the best and worked at the best in the first place. So
Right.
Guess what? It's not like when I was cutting my teeth at college.
Yeah.
Where
it's not
everything was a nightmare.
Not trying to do something in the dorm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
No.
there is a bit of you have to take this advice with a grain of salt, like, and I do realize that, but it's part of the journey that's most exciting. And
my experience for everybody out here is, when I go to a mastering facility like Eric's, and well, that's the only one I go to, but when I go to his facility, I don't go there with the idea of trying to change what I've done in the mix. I go there trying to get what I've done in the mix at a very high sample rate. When it has to be reduced to a much lower sample rate because of the way the industry is, I normally mix everything at 192, and it usually ends up at 48 or 44.1. So my accomplishment with him is to get that, when it's dithered from my sample rate down to where it has to go, to make it sound the same as the way it sounded when I mixed it. That sounds easy, but that's really very hard to do, and he does it as good as anybody. And I know, because I take what he sends me and I put it into a session.
He gives me the audition every single time.
And I A/B between the original mix at 192 and the ones he sends me at 48 or 44.1. And if I can't get him to sound the same, then it's not working. So, and it's really about how he transfers the music. That, to me, is the biggest part of mastering that people don't get. People usually think that it's, the EQ or rolling the bottom off or compressing. It's got nothing to do with any of that. That's all eyewash. It's really about being able to dither that audio from the highest sample rate you can mix at down to what it has to be, and not have it change drastically, not have it shrink sideways, not have it shrink vertically.
And the trick to being able to do all of that is, it's so simple. It's your monitoring. You need to have your monitoring set up where you can trust it. And as if your speakers now don't exist. Like your monitoring side of everything, it should be so finely tuned and your body used to that environment, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
You make your choices in your room.
Yeah.
But it should be like it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And then that's when you can make those decisions and know that you're doing that right.
Exactly. And that's why
and then
these
it translates to your room. That's why you come here
those speakers
and do that.
have been those tannoys that I mixed through with the Doug Sachs crossovers have been there 35 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You even have special ATCs. No one can get those.
Yeah, well, they can now. They're making them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I got ATC to build these speakers for me because I wanted a passive pair of speakers from them. They only make powered speakers. So they built those for me, and then they started selling them. So,
well,
okay, we're moving on here.
Get your autograph.
I want to know what's the origin of the bakery and what's behind the name of it.
Really pretty simple, but it's kind of funny. Like when, let's say, probably high school years when I was getting the recording bug and like the techie bug, and that kind of launched my passion into this field and everything. I always thought to myself that if one day I own a studio, I'm going to call it the bakery because my last name is Boulanger, which in French means baker. And bakery is just kind of a, if you didn't know that, it's still a fun thing to play around. Like, you know, when I send out references, I'll always say it's baked on this day.
Yeah,
baked.
Yeah.
You know, it's just fun to play around with.
Yeah.
And I always knew that. And in fact, when things had to go together to open the bakery rather quickly after Doug's passing and the closure of the mastering lab, it was just so funny doing all the paperwork like with the state to get incorporated and all of this. It was like, it was the one thing in this massive process that I didn't even have to think about it. I was just like, the bakery.
It was already in place.
Yeah, like because I had known that since probably 14 years old.
Yeah.
It was just like, that's what it's going to be.
Great.
And
all right.
Yeah.
That's how it happened, folks.
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't think it was going to happen ever, but it did.
Okay, what is, you know, your mastering chain, your speakers, you know, your equipment, the console, the whole setup that you use? You kind of describe it.
It's a good thing you were asking about, or we were speaking about monitoring just before. So what we'll do is go backwards. And in fact, you know, a critique I have of a lot of recording programs, like, you know, undergraduate programs and whatnot, like with students learning to record and get into this field, like the first thing they do is like, set up a session. And yeah, it's real fun setting up mics and having a whole band there and it's flashy, big studio. I get it. But I mean, could you ask of a virgin student anything harder to do than that? Like what should be taught should be exactly flipped upside down. You should start with mastering. Because what are we doing? We're taking the stereo format, and then you can listen to what every other record has sounded like for the past, 50 years. Start with your monitoring. Start with stuff you know that you haven't worked on. Work your way backwards. So to answer your question, ATC 150s are my main thing.
That's your go-to speaker system.
Yeah. And then that backs up to
and how did you get turned on to ATCs and
easy.
What made
it's
you?
What Doug had in Ojai.
Oh.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right. So that's
about the only difference between my studio and the mastering lab, and this was kind of funny because it was like every time we'd go to an AES show, Doug and I or something like that, and you know they have the ATC set up, and we're very tight with ATC. We know everyone there. We had their new super tweeters before anyone else did. We do a lot of listening, but in Ojai, because he was modeling it after Hollywood, and in Hollywood the speaker system was completely hand built. Sherwood. It was passive crossovers, 2 JBL 15-inch subs, an Altec horn, and an EV super tweeter, and it was all baffle wall mounted because it was kind of the time, and it's horn, so you know you're using the room as part of the speaker sound.
Right.
So
softened speakers.
Then come to Ojai. I know Doug was intrigued and wanted to use and get the ATC 150s because of James Guthrie. He'd go up to his studio in Tahoe, and they were working on things, and they'd master some of the Pink Floyd stuff up there. And Guthrie had the ATCs when they were a little bit newer. And so that's what Doug put in, but then he made this baffle around everything. And I mean, the room sounded great, and obviously we could work. But Doug and I would go to AES, and I remember, them playing a high-res thing, even something we worked on. And by virtue of, these like setups that they truck in for those conventions, everything was freestanding, and the ATCs, they're meant to be freestanding. Well, unlike yours, these are symmetric, but most of the 150s, the tweeters are offset, right? Because it's because of the flanging of this side. That's the whole physics of it, and it's meant to do that. And we'd go to the freestanding ones, and the first time they lit up something that we had even done, they turned it on, and I just looked over at Doug because I was like, oh shit, this sounds way better than our place. And Doug looked me square back in the eye, and he's like, just don't say it. And I was like, we were on the same page.
Got it.
And it was always like that. Now fast forward to bakery days, and when I opened in my space, I mean, it would have been a real construction / pain in the ass to have it baffle mounted if that were to sound better. But I knew from day one, there's no way in hell I'm putting it in a baffle, because I knew those things sound better freestanding.
The Sound Factory, they were softened, the Utah woofers when the boxes were,
exactly,
the super reds were in a box in the wall.
Right.
But it's interesting because when I first started the Sound Factory, we had those Altec 604E utility speakers in the original utility boxes, and that's when...
And those were meant for corners, right?
Yep, and that's when Doug Sachs first started the whole pro side of the Mastering Lab audio, and he would put 2x4s inside the boxes to stiffen them.
Right.
And then he got a hacksaw and he cut the honeycomb horns out so that the horns in the 604E was just an open space, and the little honeycomb part was just gone.
Yeah.
And then it just grew from there,
So monitoring is definitely the most important. So working backwards from monitoring, then I use SADI for the record machine, so that's what captures everything. And whatever format we might be making, typically it's going to be in the 44 realm because of either CD or streaming. I will
CD
record...
is usually 44.1, and streaming is usually 48.
We won't get into the details of all of that, but it's there's many different things. But the point is, whatever format I'm making for whatever it is, I'm capturing at that rate in that format, so that my monitoring reflects, it's not like I'm hearing something you're never going to hear ever again off the bus. I'm hearing through the whole process. It's what you're taking home.
Right.
And so then before that, if I'm doing either A to D or even D to D using an SRC, I use a hardware SRC, which is inside of what Josh built for me. So all of my converters in the studio are built by Josh Florian, JCF Audio. They're custom for the studio because it also involves routing for specifically how I use things. It's kind of, instead of having to rely on like a patch bay or too many switches, it's just, it kind of skips a few steps and makes the wire length shorter,
Yeah, sure.
And so conversion is all JCF. And then analog processing, basically, I have two flavors of EQs, but actually seldom use it because any of my analog processors are actually kind of heavy-handed, because you're even though they might be in half dB steps, sometimes that's more than what's needed, especially on something like what you deliver me.
Right.
So usually if I'm using my analog gear, it's because I'm being a little heavy-handed and that's what it needs. But typically it's like something that's like polished, like valve stuff, I'm usually only using like the Massenburg EQ in the box because, you know, you can go to 63.7 hertz at 0.4 dB.
Yeah, right.
You know, you can dial it in exactly.
Yeah.
And that semblance of less is more.
Yeah.
Instead of yanking on a few knobs to probably end up with the same shape, you know, you can dial this in perfectly.
Yeah.
And aside from that, on the board, the biggest thing that I'll use whenever I'm doing anything, taking it as an analog, is the line amps. I have a solid state version and a tube version, and they're just two different flavors of ice cream.
Yeah.
And they work in tandem also with the A to D, like
Right.
the gain staging of everything. So that's where you get a lot of that openness. And then on the source side, when you send me anything, I use Pro Tools to play into the system, and that's mainly because it handles all the various plugins that I may use a lot better. Pro Tools is made heaps and leaps since Pro Tools 1.
Yeah, well, yeah. My God. I mean, I actually helped them develop the HDX system. I was part of that.
I remember.
That part of that development. It's interesting, too, because he's talking about Josh Florian's converters right over here. This is JCF audio in my patch bay that I do all the mixing to 2-track through. I do it with the JCF converter. It's a pretty amazing device that Josh built. It's called a lathe. It's a 2-channel converter, and that's where I mix at 192. So everything goes through that. What type of lathe do you have in the bakery?
The lathe at the bakery, well, like all professional lathes that are up and running and making the records you buy in stores, every single one of them is
Vinyl.
Yes, vinyl record
Records.
is some form of Frankenstein. But the root, the main thing is it's a Neumann VMS 70 with an SX74 Neumann cutter head. Those two things are completely stock. I bought the lathe from Stan Ricker. Doug had introduced Stan and I, and in fact, I even worked on this lathe well before. And unfortunately, Stan also passed away, and his one request, pretty much dying wish, was because he always kept cutting his entire life. It was in his garage. He lived in Ridgecrest, California, and he's just told his family he doesn't want to see his lathe go to a museum. He doesn't want it a museum piece. I'm dumbing down the language because
well, but how did you know
he
that
cursed like a sailor?
how did you know that he wanted to get rid of it?
Oh no, he passed away. And
the family contacted you? Oh.
And because Stan had arranged a short list of people they should contact in the first place.
I see.
And and his wish was that he didn't want it to be a museum piece. He wanted someone who was going to make records.
And what kind of things did you have to do to it to get it to work now? Because
there was a good amount, just cleanup from old things, but he had actually kept everything in amazing condition. The electronics were something very custom and everything that he had used, but not really up my alley. But ever since the mastering lab, I had a design in my head of what I would want to do with the cutter head, and we had the 74 at mastering lab. We had a 74 and a 68 cutter head at the mastering lab, so I was well familiar with all of this. And we had the tube amps that Sherwood had built, and they were great, but certainly had their limitations as well. And I always had this idea, but the problem with the lathe is they're so moody, and because they're so fine-tuned, that the second you're up and able to make product, you're hesitant to make any change to anything because it's like, okay, we're working.
Yeah.
And so it's
well,
very
they're
difficult.
finicky too.
Well, that's
because
what
I mean it's a design basically that was created in the 40s and it really didn't change much.
No.
All the way up until today. you
Yeah.
know.
It hasn't changed at all.
Yeah.
But the audio electronics now of my lathe is all the stuff that I built. And it was because what Stan had for electronics in his system, it wasn't right. I didn't think it sounded the best. And so because I was starting from scratch, instead of just going for it and trying to work as fast as possible, I was like, you know what, Eric, take the opportunity to do what you always wanted. It might not have worked. Well, it did. So all the audio side, anything powering that cutter head, that's all my stuff. And then also that works in tangent with the control system, which is what actually makes the lathe move and decides the groove width and whatnot. All of that, I have my own. It works with the computer, the control system. It's based off of the CompuDisc. I still use the panel for it because why not? The buttons are there. But
Yeah. Well, the biggest thing about that is that they have computers in them. When I was mastering stuff on a lathe with Doug Sachs, when I was doing vinyl records for Linda Ronstadt and James Taylor, the biggest arguments that I ever got into with Doug was level, because I always put a lot of bottom end on everything. And when you have a lot of bass and you're trying to get a good level on a vinyl disc, the more bottom you have, the more sideways the groove wants to go, and the more it's apt to have the needle jump out.
Yeah, not only do you have that problem, but you also have less time on the record because it takes up the most space.
Right. So we were always fighting, for the level and the time, and also, he'd say,
this is how you got kicked out the first time.
Yeah, right. He'd say, you're not going to pass any of the skip tests, because they would have these really cheap turntables with these cheap needles, and they'd play the pressing, and if the needle jumped out of the groove, they'd reject the pressing. And, when you're sitting there with a Linda Ronstadt record, it's like the fall line for, Asylum Records, and all the players are calling you up going, the pressings aren't passing, so it gets a little crazy. What's the most rewarding project you ever worked on?
Oh boy. Okay, wowzers.
And it doesn't have to be me.
Oh, that.
No, I mean
that one project we were talking about. That we'll leave names out. It's not even released, but we ended up mastering a session of Val's, and it was kind of a session that came out of COVID, and so the string parts that were on it, I guess they had done kind of like bedroom recording and pieced everything together. And loudmouth Eric mastering engineer had to make a comment. I was like, "Oh, what's up with these fake strings? This is a great song." They're like, "They're real," and I was like, "Uh-oh." And well, lo and behold, we ended up redoing the strings, and I was playing on a few sessions one day, and we got to piggyback off of that session. So me and my quartet, we redid the string parts and
free orchestra.
Yeah, pretty much. So we did things very quickly, and it was the first time I got to send him recording tracks, which was just entertaining for me. And Val was like, "Well, this all sounds great and everything, but I don't send me the comp." Like, he was assuming everything was comped and that he could kind of piece together or listen to other takes. I'm like, there is no comp. We played it once head to tail, and Val was like, "Oh, shit."
Yeah.
Okay. I'm like, that's literally all that exists.
Exactly.
That was fun. So I think there's more fun experiences that come along the way. And also in true mastering form, the big difference between a recording engineer, mixing engineer, and a mastering engineer is a recording engineer probably has to spend like 6 months on a full album worth of a project, something like that.
Could be 6
Could be.
months.
I mean, it could be anything.
Could be 2 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Through the Eagles.
I'm trying to average things roughly. There's no way of averaging it. A mixer might take a month, could be less or longer, but definitely a mastering engineer, we do an album in a day. Right. And then the next day we're doing another and another. So the point is, I don't even remember what I did yesterday, but I can say recently just worked on the new Moana 2 soundtrack, and there's some great stereotypical Disney melodic tracks in there. And there were many chefs in the kitchen. It's massive. It was so much work. And certainly recently that was very rewarding because of just how much had to be done in so many different formats, and of course time crunch. So
Yeah, right, exactly.
it really was one of those.
All got to be done tomorrow.
Oh yeah. Anytime the phone rings for me, it's due yesterday. So
Yeah.
I always take that with a grain of salt. But this one was a little over the top.
Oh, it must have been great though, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Last but not least, what do you have for those people out there that want to become a mastering engineer?
Patience.
Patience, that's a good one.
Patience is definitely, well, it's even part of the job. Even once you're in my chair, patience is the biggest thing of being a mastering engineer. You really have to know your room, make sure that, that monitoring and everything and setting up your room and your environment, it takes a while, and making sure that everything's at its tip-top level where you can trust it. And then, and that requires patience. The second you put up speakers in your room, you're like, okay, let's get working. And it's like, you got to make sure of things. And that's very hard to control. And in general, throughout your career, like getting to that point even obviously requires patience. It's the gaining the experience and experiences.
Yeah, well, you paid your dues.
Yeah, exactly.
You did your grunt work over
yeah, there's
in
all
the Cadillac,
but it all leads down to really what separates a professional mastering engineer from an amateur starting out is it's that first day where you're asked, okay, master this, and you have no help from anyone or anything, and it's that confidence to, once you get to what you want, the confidence to hit send to the client. That's very difficult, and that's what requires patience to get there, and the skill of gaining the confidence is the whole kit and caboodle.
Okay. Well, thanks for doing this.
Thank you. An
I really
honor.
appreciate it. And I hope you guys get something out of this. And we'll let you know what the next one is soon. We're going to have a lot of surprises here. So stick around. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment, and turn on notifications. Don't miss any of the new things coming up. There's going to be lots of surprises, so keep your eye on this.